In the previous lesson, we learned how to factor quadratic trinomials. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use what we know about factoring in order to solve quadratic equations. Solving quadratic equations by factoring revolves around the zero product property. The zero product property just states that if the product of two numbers is zero, that means that one of the factors must be equal to zero. Think about what you learned in elementary school. 3 times 0 is 0. 0 times -7 is 0. 1/2 times 0 is 0. 0 times anything is 0. So if you have the product of two numbers that is equal to 0, that tells you that one of those two factors must equal 0. So in this case, if a times b equals 0, that means either a equals 0 or b equals 0. That is called the zero product property. Let's look at example 1. In example 1, the quadratic equation is already factored for us. So what we see is a multiplication problem. We see that x minus 8 times x plus 3 equals 0. Now, at first glance, you see the parentheses, and some of you might want to distribute that, but it's actually already as easy as it's going to get here. We know that from the zero product property, if x minus 8 times x plus 3 equals 0, then one of those factors has to be equal to 0. So either x minus 8 is equal to 0, or x plus 3 is equal to 0. And all you have to do is solve for x in both equations. So on the left side, if you have x minus 8 equals 0, to get x by itself, we're just going to add 8 to both sides. So here our final answer is x equals positive 8. On the right-hand equation, we have x plus 3 equals 0. So to get x by itself, we're just going to subtract 3 on both sides. That gives us x equals -3. Likewise, in example 2, we have the product is equal to 0. So 3x plus 2 times 4x minus 1 equals 0. And we know that if the product is 0, that tells us that one of these factors must equal 0. So either 3x plus 2 is equal to 0, or 4x minus 1 is equal to 0. And all you have to do from here is solve for x to get your two solutions. So in the left-hand equation, to isolate the variable, we would begin by subtracting 2, which gives us 3x equals -2. Then to get x by itself, I would divide by 3 on both sides. So here my answer, x equals -2/3. On the right-hand equation, we would solve very similarly. To get x by itself, I would add 1 to both sides, which gives us 4x equals 1. And then to get x by itself, we'll just divide by 4 on both sides. So my final answer here, x equals 1/4. Now these two examples are pretty easy because it's already factored for you. Let's look at some where we're going to have to do the factoring ourselves. Example number 3, we have x squared minus 9x minus 22 equals 0. Here we know that it already is equal to 0. We just need to figure out what the product is. That's where factoring is going to come into play. So remember, factoring, you're trying to figure out what times what equals x squared minus 9x minus 22. We know it has to start with x times x in order to give us the x squared. The other two numbers you're going to have to figure out. So remember, these other two numbers, you have to figure out what times what gives you -22, and what plus what gives you -9. So we're trying to figure out what the factors are here. So let's see, that would be negative 11 and positive 2. Negative 11 times 2 is negative 22, and negative 11 plus 2 is negative 9. So my factors are x minus 11 and x plus 2. So from here, I know that x minus 11 times x plus 2 is equal to 0. And if the product is 0, that means one of the factors has to be equal to 0. So either x minus 11 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. And we're just going to solve both of these to figure out what x is. So on the left-hand side here, I would just add 11. And I get x equals positive 11. And on the right-hand side, I would subtract 2, which gives us x equals negative 2. And those would be my answers to number 3. Number 4 is a bit trickier because remember this whole principle revolves around the zero product property. Number 4 is not equal to 0. It's equal to 9x. So what we need to do is take that 9x and move it over to the other side. So I'm just going to subtract 9x. And when I do have to make sure that I put it in order. So I need the x squared to come first, then the minus 9x, then the plus 14 equals 0. Once it's equal to 0, now you can factor. So we need to know what times what gives us x squared minus 9x plus 14. So obviously it would start with x times x to get the x squared, but to find those other two missing numbers, we're going to have to ask ourselves, what times what equals 14, and what plus what equals negative 9. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to 14 and add up to negative 9. So it's going to have to be two negative numbers because we know a negative times a negative will give us a positive. And we know the sum has to be negative 9. So here that's going to be negative 7 and negative 2. Negative 7 times negative 2 is positive 14. And negative 7 plus negative 2 is negative 9. So our factors are x minus 7 and x minus 2. Now those aren't our answers. To get our answers, we actually have to solve for x. So here's where we will apply the zero product property. We have x minus 7 times x minus 2 equals 0. So we know that one of these factors has to be equal to 0. So either x minus 7 is equal to 0 or x minus 2 is equal to 0. And now we just solve for x. The left-hand equation, I'll add 7 to both sides, so we end up with x equals 7. And on the right-hand equation, we'll just add 2 to both sides, so we end up with x equals 2. Let's take a look at two more complicated examples. Number 5, we have 2x squared plus 15x equals 8. We know right off the bat that if we're going to use the zero product property, the equation has to be equal to 0. So we're going to take the 8, we're just going to subtract 8 and move it to the other side. Remember, we need this to be in order, so we want the 2x squared to go first, and then the plus 15x to go second, and then that minus 8 should go at the end, equals 0. Now I said this one was more complicated. The only thing that makes it more complicated is you don't have a regular x squared, you have a 2x squared. So remember what you do with that 2, you take the 2 and you're going to multiply it to the end. So we're working with x squared plus 15x minus 16 equals 0. From here we can factor. We know that x times x gives us x squared. And for the rest of our factors, we need to find two numbers that multiply to negative 16, and the same two numbers need to add up to positive 15. That would have to be negative 1 and 16. Negative 1 times 16 is negative 16, and negative 1 plus 16 is positive 15. So we would have x minus 1 and x plus 16. Now, here's the step to remember. By 2 up here, we have to remember to divide by 2 in this step. So 16 divided by 2 is easy. That one's just going to be x plus 8. 1 divided by 2 is another story. 1 divided by 2 is a decimal, and you can't have decimals in your factor, so you just move that 2 up front. This will be 2x minus 1. Now, we've done the factoring part, but these are not our answers. We still need to solve for x. So remember the zero product property. If you have 2x minus 1 times x plus 8 equals 0, then one of those factors has to be equal to 0. So either 2x minus 1 is equal to 0, or x plus 8 is equal to 0. Now I'm running out of space here, so let's just think about how to solve for x. On the left-hand equation, if you're going to get x by itself, you're going to do two things. First, you're going to add 1 and then divide by 2. So you would add 1 and then divide by 2. Your answer over here would be 1/2. On the other side, to get x by itself, you would just subtract 8. So our answer here would be x equals negative 8. Now for number 6, go ahead and pause the video. I want you to try this one on your own. When you're ready to check your answer, press play. So again, this example, we need for it to be set equal to 0. So we're going to take this 8x and start by moving it to the other side. Do make sure that you have all of your terms in order. So the 3x squared goes first, then the minus 8x, then the minus 35. Once it's equal to 0, now you can factor this problem. So in order to factor, we're going to take that 3 in the front and we're going to multiply it to the back. That's going to be x squared minus 8x minus 105 equals 0. And we start factoring. So we've got x times x to get x squared. But for the other two numbers, we need two numbers that multiply to negative 105. And the same two numbers need to add up to negative 8. So here we start crunching some numbers in the calculator. We're trying to figure out what multiplies to negative 105 and adds up to negative 8. And I'm getting negative 15 and positive 7. Negative 15 times 7 is negative 105, and negative 15 plus 7 is negative 8. So here I have x minus 15 and x plus 7. Don't forget to divide by 3, which leaves us in this step with x minus 5. In the second factor, you'll move the 3 to the front because this is a decimal, so you would have 3x plus 7. Now we're not done yet. All we've done so far is factor. You still have to solve for x. So if the product is 0, that means one of our factors must be equal to 0. So either x minus 5 is equal to 0 or 3x plus 7 is equal to 0. And each one of those you'll solve for x. So on the left-hand equation, if you add 5, you end up with x equals 5. And in the right-hand equation, in order to solve for x, you would do two things. First, you would subtract 7, which gives you negative 7. Then you would divide by 3, which gives you negative 7 over 3. This concludes the first part of the lesson over solve by factoring. When you're ready, please play the second part of the lesson.